Once again, the news is filled with one seeming crisis after another, from chaos at the southern border to an allegation from the nation's top law enforcer that the government was spying on the Trump campaign and making sure more Detroiters can get online. We'll talk with the city's new director of digital inclusion. Today is Sunday, April 14th, 2019, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint on this April 14th. So perhaps you're working to get your taxes completed this morning, or maybe you're just holding off until tomorrow before sending the check for those taxes in. Still grumpy with the withholding tables, which were off for a lot of taxpayers this year. Whatever you're paying into the government coffers, you got to see your money at work this week. Government hearings, legal decisions, and maneuvers, threats, counter threats, and yep, your tax dollars actually pay for all of it. There was a lot to chew on this week, though once again, I'm fairly certain that few minds were changed as Americans just seem to dig more deeply into whatever borough they've chosen. So Bill Barr's appearance on Capitol Hill was either a very clear and strong explanation of his take on the Mueller report, Obamacare, and spying on the Donald Trump campaign, as he put it, or it was a very worrisome showing by a man who seems to be less the United States Attorney General and more the president's personal lawyer. I heard very little in between this week. William Barr is either one thing or the other, it seems. We had the fight over the president's tax returns. We had what have become very entrenched battle lines on immigration and asylum seekers. And once again, I found myself thinking, if everything is a crisis, then maybe nothing is a crisis. We're going to talk about all that this morning. We're also going to talk about the city's efforts to bridge the digital divide. We're going to talk to the new Detroit Director of Digital Inclusion. And we're also going to start an occasional celebration of this program turning 20 years old. It's all today on Flashpoint. No idea if our country is full, as the president declared last week, but I do know the round table is. So with me this morning are Dennis Cowan, attorney from Plunkett Cooney, and the former mayor of Royal Oak. Portia Roberson, former attorney with the U.S. Justice Department, now the head of Focus Hope. Zoe Clark back with us again. She's the program director at Michigan Radio, and the former majority leader of the Michigan Senate, Randy Richardville. Thanks, gang, for being here. Portia, let me start with you. As we watched William Barr this past week, it was a stunning thing to hear an attorney general of the United States say there was spying going on a presidential campaign. And as I pointed out, I think there's a difference of opinion here over whether William Barr was saying the things as he sees them and as they should be said, or if he was acting more as the president's personal attorney rather than the attorney general. I have a hunch I know where you're going to go, but what did you think?
I am fascinated by the willingness of people to risk their reputation and their entire careers for Donald Trump. I am shocked by the fact that they are willing to put it all on the line to serve him in whatever capacity and come up with whatever he says to come up with and put that out there as that's the position they take. I mean, the Attorney General of the United States saying that there was spying going on in the department that he runs during the time that he's been there, or during the time of the previous person, but during the time of this administration, is incredible. It's incredible to watch. And it continues to happen with various people in the administration, with people who support him, that they just will risk it all for Donald Trump. Let
me move to the other attorney with us this morning. Dennis, to say this is what I think happened, I don't have any proof of it. Responsible? How did you feel about him saying that?
Well, first of all, he's the man on the hot seat right now since the Mueller report has come out.
Right.
As a result, he did, I think, an excellent job coming up to Congress and reminding them that they pass regulations that allow redactions for very good reasons, such as grand jury testimony and individuals who were not indicted at all, who maybe were questioned, but their names will be redacted, and of course classified material. As Portia said, there's been a lot of incredible things that have happened in the past 2 years. There's many of us on the Republican side who believe some of the incredible things happened at the FBI and the DOJ, and look at what has happened to those two institutions. Bill Barr has had this job before. I predict he said something he knows about, and I agree with Ken Starr. Stay tuned.
Well, but that's the frustrating aspect of all of this, I think.
I never get to talk anymore.
Anyway, I was going to say.
Right.
No, but I mean, so you dropped this word like spying, and then when the senators sort of were like, well, hold on, hey there, just a second, and said, you know,
is that what you really mean to say?
Yes, and then it was, well, you know, this is what's thought of, and it was like, oh, so there's the group that's invested. Well, no, there's not a group. These are concerns, right? And so the issue I think I have is like this idea of just kind of throwing the bomb in and then going, Okay, and that does feel a little Trumpian, right? Where you throw out some things with maybe necessarily facts that don't go along with it, and then it leads to a lot of folks like us sitting around and saying, well, what did he or doesn't he mean? When I think sometimes then the focus isn't on other important issues.
And the headline sticks no matter how that goes.
AG says spying happened. Right, yeah.
Well, I don't know if we're ever going to get to the bottom of this thing. It's been going on for seemingly years. How long ago was the election now? 2 years? 2 years plus? And we talk about this person spying. Today, with the technologies out there today, how can anybody be surprised that anyone's listening in on any conversation?
Apparently Alexa's hearing everything.
They had an Alexa in the campaign that was spying.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. I mean, so I don't know what all the big deal is. I mean, I think it's a lot of talk, and at the same time, I don't know why there's people are surprised. But the FBI, is the FBI just investigating one side or the other? And I think that's part of the question.
This is an interesting thing to me, because now James Comey has become very vilified by the right. Don't you think there's a case to be made that if James Comey had not reopened the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails 9 days before the election, that, I mean, didn't he do, wasn't that a finger on the scale as we were just heading to the election?
Oh, I'm sure that anyone that has some common sense would think that's possibly true. Yeah. But it's all opinions, you know. There's not a whole lot of facts being rolled out. And again, I've been investigated by the FBI, the Republican campaign committee, the Democrat campaign committee. They look to make sure we're doing things the right way. So whether something was happening that's wrong or not, I don't know. But I'm also a little bit concerned about getting the FBI and putting them behind, on trial. Because I want them to be doing their work to protect us and to protect our country. And I don't want everything they do to be out in front of every motive being questioned by this department or that department. So.
Well, and the little tidbit, of course, about the James Comey firing rate is that Jared Kushner was actually one of the ones that came up with the plan and thought Democrats would actually not do anything about the firing because they would be happy because there was still anger.
Still anger over
and
him.
Look how that turned out. That was not quite how the end of the movie finished, but it's still an interesting note.
To other portions, Dennis, though, of his remarks that day, when he was asked about trying to abolish Obamacare, as the Justice Department is doing, he kind of seemed to take up the president's case and said, well, here's what the president wants to do on that. When he was asked about the opioid problem in America, he said, well, that's part of why we need a wall, which is taking up the president's case. And I think some people were troubled that seemed rather baldly political rather than an attorney general's behavior.
Well, those issues that he was talking about have been out there already, and certainly cabinet members are expected, on the most part, in the Obama administration, Bush, every administration I've seen, have come up.
Oh, I think Eric Holder was often criticized for the same thing, right?
I did not find his comments particularly partisan. I think he was being very straightforward. Remember, he was up there supposedly talking about his budget. Everybody tried to sideline him.
That's what this was supposed to be about.
And he did I think some of the points he was trying to make were to try and get people focused on what he was up there for and what he was trying to get done, and quite frankly, some very important things that he's trying to do with the DOJ budget.
But I do want to point out, though, that during my time at the Justice Department, one of the things that I routinely had to tell friends at the White House or at other agencies is that the Department of Justice cannot do things at the will of the president if they're illegal things, right? So you can't just say, president just call and say, hey, I want you to do this, and the AG doesn't necessarily do those things. We have to have some separation between those things. So while I understand that cabinet members are asked questions and they speak about some of the things that are on the president's agenda, they may mention it. I think it's stepping over the line when you talk about saying why we need a wall or why we need to abolish health care. That's not really the role. To me, at this point, Obama's health care program is still legal, it's still in place, and he is supposed to execute that until something changes. That hasn't changed yet. So why is the AG bringing that out as what we need to do? He should be carrying forth the law as it's already written and not kind of commenting on what he thinks should be the next thing. The state of independence in those two.
How that worked during the Kennedy administration.
It may or may not have worked during the Kennedy administration with two brothers. I mean, I understand because of the president.
You're actually talking about.
Well, I mean, and listen, I'm not naive enough to believe that cabinet members, including the Attorney General, are never going to be asked or never end up speaking on a topic. But I think you have to be very careful about the line you might cross as an attorney when you start talking about what the president wants, at least at that level, because you want to make sure there is some sense of, for instance, with the Defense of Marriage Act, when that was still a legal thing, the Justice Department, we had to do the things that were necessary to carry that out. Now, whether Eric Holder agreed with it or not, whether the president already said he wanted to get rid of that, that's not relevant to whether or not we have to keep going with it.
I get a couple of minutes left with our segment here, and I wanted to bring it back closer to home. Zoe, the mayor, we saw, of course, we had two people charged in the demolitions thing,
Indeed.
which we've been watching that investigation. The other track of all this, though, is this now really interesting investigation into this nonprofit attached to Dr. Sonia Hassan, who may or may not be linked to the mayor. He's not wanting to answer questions about his private life, which I think it feels like a lot of most journalists in town have sort of allowed that, bought into that, especially since the statement from he and his wife. But when that becomes the central part of the investigation, where there are favors here, can he continue to say, well, I'm not really interested in talking about that?
Well, I think whether or not there are favors is still sort of to be determined. I think the fact is, though, is that you now have these sort of points on a map, right, that have sort of started to link together in terms of that this woman is a woman who has been out doing this thing for this organization that she's been doing, and the fact that she got a grant from the city, and this is the mayor of this city. I mean, it depends on what we end up finding out about this relationship. But look, grant money is grant money, and we'll see where there are other organizations that were in line or that were looking for it. And there's still, I think there's still a lot in this story still that we need to better understand.
Nobody, Randy, would suggest that this isn't a noble cause to talk about trying to help Detroit moms take their babies to term. Obviously, prenatal health care, it's a terribly, but there's a lot of people, I imagine, standing around going, I got an important cause here too, and I'm able to get grant money. So is there anything to it, do you think?
It's hard for me to know those kinds of things. I don't know what's happening with the administration regarding this issue very well. So
it's hard to know.
Yeah, but I'm just not close to it. I'd rather not give an opinion on something I don't know about, which is weird for a politician. You know?
Yes, it is. Quite weird.
Well, but this is an area where I think a lot of people would rather stay out of it because it feels there's something icky about it. Watching these banners that Robert Carmack is running over the city, I think a lot of people find that very distasteful. A lot of the reporters I know in this very building have felt it, uncomfortable to cover that, and yet this is central to the issue, isn't it?
Well, and the fact that, he held this press conference a couple months ago. Right. He was going to expose all this stuff, and then he didn't, but then he, uses the helicopter or the plane to, fly around what he wanted to, I guess, say at the press conference. So it just gets sort of, mired in the gossipy form of things rather than allowing for whatever investigation. I know the IG is going to do an investigation. I think that there have been some asks from maybe the council members or someone else. And so I think the reality is you let that carry out and see what happens.
Well, two things. One, having been a mayor of a much smaller town, but nevertheless a mayor, we always get involved in helping support nonprofits in the community because they're very important to the social, cultural fabric of the community. So I think that that's part of your bully pulpit. Totally understand that. Whether or not there was any issue relative to this particular grant, there's grant guidelines, where the money came from, where it's going, and I think that'll all sort itself out. But something that happened very important last week. Moody's rated the 2020 Detroit budget as credit positive, including sound financial practices, conservative revenue assumptions, significant capital investment, and setting aside funds for the 2024 spike in pensions that's coming. As someone who worked with the Senate Majority Leader on the grand bargain, represented the foundations, this is very good news. And I think hopefully the mayor will not get distracted by this and keep up the good work with the council. I'm really glad you got that in. Thanks, gang, for being here very much. We continue. We'll talk about the digital divide in Detroit on Flashpoint.